Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
And hello, everybody, and welcome once again. Thank you so much. Glad to be here. This is Doug, and I am here on a beautiful spring day once again. Hey, we got to talk about it while we still have it, right? But I'm here with Cody. Hey, Cody.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I am glad you're listening, and thanks for engaging again with us and sending your questions and feedback and thoughts and all of that good stuff. And I have thoroughly enjoyed the last episode we did because I was able to interview you, and we were able to have a conversation about integral theology. So I'm excited again about today's conversation.
Me too,
and
yeah.
I want to jump into it with you. So for our listeners, if you didn't catch part one, you might want to bump back to the previous episode.
Yeah.
And to give you a little bit of help as far as the trajectory in which we're headed. And then for those that have listened and you're back with us today, I'm really excited because our guest is back with us today.
Man, I'm back. I am back. Well, I couldn't turn down the speaker
The
fee.
indomitable Doug
Yes.
King himself,
Yeah.
the CEO of Presence International. And the thing about Presence that I always love the tagline, but we're curating a global conversation for a new earth.
That's right.
And I am thrilled to ask more questions about
Right?
what the people want to hear. I think you got to give the people what they want, Doug.
Oh, man, that's what I understand.
So that's what we're attempting to do.
Yeah.
Now, what we're doing today is an introduction to integral theology, and this would be part 2.
Yes.
So last week, we ended with kind of your working definition of integral theology. And then we talked about the distinction between integral theology versus integral spirituality. What I want to do today is I want to continue in that vein a little bit and dig a little bit deeper into integral theology and what it actually is and how it's different from, we might say, a traditional theology or a postmodern worldview or theology. So that's where I want to head. And then when you talk about world religions, when you talk about what you're up to with your Venn diagram. So a couple more episodes are coming down the pipe, but we're trying to bring clarity again around what integral theology actually is. This is, after all, an introduction, so we won't be going into full detail. So that said, let's start with this, Doug. When you talk about integral theology, what might be helpful is, as we begin this conversation today, how would you distinguish integral theology from traditional theology? So like the 3 dominant worldviews that are on the world today: traditional, modern, postmodern.
That's good.
What does a traditional theology, a modern theology, and a postmodern theology look like versus an integral theology?
Great question. And the reason we're going back over some of this material, and for those of you that have followed these podcasts for the last year and a half, you know that we've talked about these things before, but Cody and I are constantly getting questions that indicate that because a lot of these thoughts are so new that he and I need to just keep going back over the points over and over again, because you all are getting questions and you're trying to explain it to other people. Let's remember that in the spiral, Cody, we've got the 2 tiers, and first tier consists of all the levels of up into and including traditional, modern, and postmodern. So when we're talking about a traditional lens or perspective that we have in life, or a modern perspective we have in life, we're talking about a first tier consciousness level that has nothing to do with the human value equation. The human value equation is not affected whatsoever. I continue to stress this because for people that are in the postmodern level, which is the last level of first tier before you go into second tier, and where we will find our integral theology, the concerns of postmodernity are rightly that no one is deemed to be superior and no one inferior. There's a real strong push for egalitarian and equality and those kinds of principles, and rightly so, and that's good. People tend to confuse these levels and perspectives as a value statement, Cody, and I always like to start there. First of all, this is not a value statement.
And I want to come back to that. So that is a question we're probably in the next episode, but I want to come back to that because I want to dig deeper because that's more of a problem than I think people realize.
Okay. Well, then let's set that aside for this moment.
Let's do that.
I've given a footnote. Now let's go to the views themselves that in this country especially, and I know we have listeners from Europe and Australia and South Africa and other places here, all of whom are close friends. Hello today. Most of us are aware of the fact that the traditional viewpoint or perspective is certainly here in the United States what we inherited when the country was founded. And that traditional viewpoint, because it is all about law and order, it replaces the warrior phase that preceded it. It wants law and order. And that is exactly what was needed at that time. It was really good. But you also have legal codes and the writing of legal codes that carry over into what becomes the definition of religion. And I say the definition of religion because religion has to have some type of boundary that distinguishes who is an appropriate member and who is not an appropriate member of that religion. And that's where codes and creeds and dogmas and doctrines come from. So when you're in that traditional mode, or if you have, like Cody and I, grown up in a traditional experience of Jesus, your traditional experience of Jesus is going to be one that most people today would call more fundamental, or would have called Cody or me a fundamentalist for the views that we had, because we would have been very interested in creeds and dogma. People would have, in fact, said to me, man, you're really dogmatic about what you believe. And I would simply say at that point, I'm merely defending the truth, that I'm not trying to do anything that is mean. I'm not trying to do anything judgmental. It's just this is the way God deems it to be, so to speak. And that is that traditional viewpoint. And the other element of that is if you're in one of those kind of churches, you know good and well that one of the worst things you can do is question the authority of those in charge of your denomination. And there are various types of elders or bishops or synods or councils that determine in the traditional view type of denominations what it is that's okay to believe, right? And what is not okay to believe. If you question in the traditional perspective, you're going to get into considerable trouble, because that is one of the no-nos of that particular worldview. You do not question authority. You obey the Caesar, the emperor, etc. So
would you say a traditional theology, so theology, study of God,
yes,
a traditional stage of consciousness study of God is not coming to ideas and concepts about the divine and asking questions, but just taking the script that is already handed to you?
Absolutely. And that script is a very tightly developed form, because it has very well-defined boundaries. And you know within your denomination, if you've stepped over a boundary, that's a real taboo. And so those forms are very tightly defined, if you will. And you are to defend the truth. That's what I found myself in that traditional perspective seeing. It was my duty to defend the truth and to make sure that everyone kept the sanctity and the wholeness of the correct truth. And so within that you will get that kind of conflict when you begin to question, which I did. And that's what led in my demise in terms of where I was going to a very fundamentalist school. When I began to question and actually deconstruct some of the things that were part of that tightly held form of truth, and each denomination has one. So in other words, we know we could all sit down. If we were all here, those of you listening, if we were all together in a room, we could start calling out the names of different denominations that immediately we would all agree would fit into that kind of category. That's not what our podcast is about. I'm just saying this is so that we understand where those perspectives come from. I respect all perspectives. I understand why people think the way they think or what they believe. I just don't agree with it. I have moved beyond it in my mind. So that's where you start with the traditional. Now, when you move into the modern, the thing that distinguishes modernity is the ability to question. Rather than not questioning, you question in modernity. And as we've said in previous podcasts, you have the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, and on the religious side, in religion, because again, modernity is a first tier, still level, so that means religion still exists. You have Luther coming along to question. He questions the Pope. He questions the authority. He questions whether every individual shouldn't have, or should have the right to their own Bible, since Gutenberg came along and with that printing press made it possible. So questioning then happens there. As that modernity developed, I think, Cody, where we see it today, if you go from the time of Luther into what would be a manifestation of modernity in our time, I really see mega churches fitting into the modern viewpoint. And what I mean by that is they generally have speakers who are well beyond forms, tightly drawn forms about the earth was created in 6 days, or the earth is only, 6,000 years old or something like that, that you actually have people that have moved beyond that. They're more modern in their updated thinking about the narrative itself. And these mega churches are all part of modernity because they're about efficiency. One of the things about efficiency is you go to a mega church, they have people out directing traffic. They got the orange cones up. They put you in a parking place. You go into that service. They have programs for your kids. You go into the main service and they have the music. The music is well orchestrated. It's beautiful, sung by people very talented. They have the words on a big board. You then get a sermon from somebody that's very well done in a time frame that is always going to end at a certain amount of minutes. Then you're going to go get your kids, and the police are going to direct you quickly out of that so you can get to the cafeteria on time. So that would be, in my mind, a manifestation of a modernist denomination.
Oh, God. Oh, my. I'm sorry. I have PTSD, so I was like post-traumatic stress there just when I hear that. Because
I noticed you starting to flinch
a little bit of the world I grew up in.
Are you okay?
Yes, okay. I think I'll be fine.
Good.
So, again, just for our listeners to know, both these stages that we're talking about, traditional and modern, are in every area of life, in every area of influence. But we're specifically talking about nuancing the distinction between integral theology and modern theology or modernity. So,
in modern theology, the one thing I didn't say that I should is that you begin there to get people who are deconstructionists. Mm-hmm. Modernity is all about deconstructing the things that came through the traditional. I mentioned, for example, these old views of the earth only being a few thousand years old and 6 days of creation. But modernity took it far beyond that. I mean, you have these historical criticism schools that started in the 17 and 1800s, and they began to actually ask questions. Did Paul write that book? Would Jesus have done those things? What parts of the Gospels are actually legitimate? What parts of the Gospels are actually not legitimate? They will question all those things, but they still come out with an outcome where the narrative has Jesus coming to form a new religion. And so in that sense, even though they have those modernity elements where they will deconstruct certain things and they will question certain things about the text itself, at the end of the day, they're still doing that within the confines of a specific denomination, and they are still very much seeing the outcome of the narrative as being Christianity.
And I feel like, Doug, that's so much of where most of my generation currently resides.
I agree.
So like the buzzword right now is deconstructing.
Yes,
Everybody's deconstructing everything. We're tearing everything down. And it certainly has its place. So would it be fair to say a traditional theology could be considered construction, a modern theology deconstruction?
Yeah.
Deconstruction?
Yeah,
Okay.
very much so. And I think another way of saying it is the traditional theology is a well-defined form that you defend, and modern theology is a deconstruction of that form that you just couldn't, you felt too constricted by it. You didn't agree with it, but you couldn't question it because you got in trouble, and eventually you had to move on to another denomination.
Yeah, so I think about even right now, how, well, obviously since Luther and even before, am I right to say this? There were people along the way that seem to be well ahead of their time.
Yeah, we call those martyrs. That's what happened in the traditional age. If you were saying beyond your time, yeah.
But take like here's an example. Take like the 5 big kind of creeds. Well, even the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, all these scripts that we were handed in the traditional theology,
right.
And then think about how our generation in some ways have had the luxury to deconstruct all these. So, I mean, right now, what people are doing with the afterlife, heaven, hell, the Bible, I mean, 150 years ago, this idea of inerrancy kind of popped into the equation, and then now it's interesting to see how people have deconstructed all that. The Trinitarian view, God, Jesus, Spirit, deconstructing all that. On and on the list goes of what people are questioning. And so that's modern theology. Now I want to move a little bit into postmodern theology, and then I want to get to the distinction, like what does an integral theology look like? But okay, where would postmodernity fall as it pertains to theology?
So postmodernity brings about a way of better dealing with the complexity of our human family. And the reason for that is because we now know through media, internet, and technology what's happening at this moment on every part of the planet, thanks to the people in media and social media. And that means that we have to deal with complexity. No longer can we just view someone who lives elsewhere as a labeled person in a way that we don't know anything about them. All of a sudden, we see their faces, they're suffering if there's a tsunami or a volcano or an earthquake, and we actually feel a need to go help those folks. So we become a feeling of more interconnected. And then what that obviously brought is that no longer are we seeing the value of a segregated church. That was a big thing, of course, here where we are in the South, that you had black congregations, you had white congregations. Does that still exist? Of course it does. But if you look at what's happening, those walls have come down in a big way, so that you do have not as much of the segregation, not as much of the discrimination. Yes, it still exists even in religion and even within denominations. It does, but not as much. The role of women. When I grew up, and I don't know how it was in Baptist church, I'm assuming the same, women had a much lower delegated role within the church services, and they certainly didn't have any part of authority. And that was the big word, that the man had the authority. So postmodernism is dealing with those issues, and they bleed over into your denomination. The biggie today, we both know, the biggie today is LGBTQ. And in postmodernity, outside of religion, people have already come to the point that, for the most part, that should no longer be an issue with regard to, again, that human value equation. There's still a big hubbub, and mainly it's because those are that are resisting postmodern denominations who are becoming affirming, inclusive, etc. That's why that's an easy one to point to as an existence of a postmodern church denomination. That means that they're seeing a bigger God, and they're seeing a God that is more inclusive, than when you roll all the way back to that traditional tightly held form where saved and lost normally had much more lost than those who were saved. And now, as the evolution of thought has taken place, theology has changed to a God that is a much more inclusive God. And we're seeing that God has put image and breath and so forth into all human beings. And so that human value equation changes, Cody. And so your theology or your God talk changes completely. But at the end of the day, you still end up with a denomination. You're still in Christianity. Jesus is still a religion.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're happy about, rightly so, is that you go to a denomination that is more inclusive than most people, but you're still in a denomination. And what that means is, as much as you've included all those people, as long as they're in your denomination, you're denominated from the rest of the world because you haven't included them in some way or another, or you wouldn't be a denomination.
Okay, I want to stop you right there. Okay, one example that I was thinking about with postmodern theology, because you're already leaning into integral theology, by the statements you just made, which I want to talk about in just a second. But one example would be what you brought up, which was certainly in the world I grew up in. They would take here's a theology. Paul's writings about women, which was at a specific time, specific place, specific reason. But it was the law, the code, the deal that was handed to us. And again, when you're in that traditional theology, let's take this example and thread it through the three stages and how and what an integral approach would be like. So you take that example and you didn't question it. It's just the way it was. So in my world that I grew up in, women did not have any leadership roles at all because this is what Paul said. And it was a universal mandate for the world. That's how they saw it. That's how they interpreted it.
Mm-hmm.
So they would be allowed to like teach a Sunday school class or something, but they were never allowed to speak on a larger level or lead or be on any kind of leadership influence, anything like that. Now, you get into modern theology, modernity, and you start questioning that, what you see. So in a lot of the mega churches right now, you see, women are starting to kind of come through, and maybe we didn't interpret this correctly, and let's talk about exactly what Paul was talking about. That's the questioning. Then you thread it all the way through the postmodernity, and that is if you don't have females on the lineup, if you don't have, then now the whole equation's flipped to where you're the one actually losing in that particular framework. What I'm curious to know is how does integral theology come into play with even that example? And then let's just talk a little bit about integral theology versus the other stages that you just mentioned, traditional, modern, postmodern.
So in every case that we just discussed about these first tier levels, in some way, they all still had a restricted form. The most restrictive form was the traditional view, but even modernity was restricted in the way that it still saw Christian, non-Christian, and postmodernity, even though it was and is today so much more inclusive, is still, by the very fact that they're calling themselves a religion, Christianity, and a denomination, by that very nature, what they're saying is that the biblical narrative is really not theology, it's Christology, because the whole emphasis is upon Christ, Christ, Christ. Christ is the end of the story, and you are either of Christ, Christianity, or you are not of Christ. When you move into an integral theology, what you're realizing is that God is, again, all in all, not all in some. So it is truly integral, everything interconnected. God is all in all. And you understand that Christ was one of the ways that God spoke, revealed, made aware to human beings. Like the writer of Hebrews, in times past, God spoke through the prophets. God spoke. In these last days, God spoke through the Son. So now you have God spoke, God spoke, God spoke, but it's through Moses, it's through David, it's through the prophets, and then finally it's through Christ. But the whole point is it's all about God. And what happens in first tier is that God gets denigrated. God gets boundaried up into denominations and religions. And the most famous bumper sticker that we've talked about so many times is the one on your car that says coexist, and it has Jesus up there with all the other world religions. And we take our place, and we're happy about the fact that we can go to interfaith movement meetings and that kind of thing. All those are good. They're steps forward. But what we're saying is the evolutionary leap that's coming, Cody, that's on the way, that no one is seeing for the most part because it's just happening. The big movement is going to be that no longer is Christ the end of the story. God is the end of the story, and God is universal in scope, and so is the identity of all human spirituality, which is a subject for another day.
So, oh, by the way, I was laughing because that is one question we did this.
Oh, good. Okay, so 20 more podcasts.
One question. Okay, in closing, because I got about a few minutes left. Integral theology, my question is, so you integrate the health of even first-tier stages. My question is, what, as an integral theology, what would you be integrating? Can you give me an example of what you might integrate from traditional theology?
Sure. So when you and I grew up, the one of the great values was that you and I both learned a lot about the narrative from Genesis all the way through Revelation. One of the things that gets lost as you move into postmodernity is an actual knowledge of the whole story. What I find in the postmodern churches is a real emphasis, not that there's anything wrong with this emphasis, but a real emphasis on like the Gospels, the parables of Jesus. But if you ask people in postmodern settings about anything from the law, the prophets, and going all the way back to the beginning of the story, a lot of times they're just not familiar with the material. And I think that's because postmodernity is trying so hard to get away from those books because they think those books are teaching something as law that should be happening today. And they're not realizing through spiral dynamics that those were simply the understandings of people who were going through those levels at that time in history.
And good God. And that's an integral perspective.
And that's an integral perspective.
And ironically, postmodernity, very sensitive stage of consciousness as it pertains to the rights of everyone.
Sure.
Indigenous folks, our
all
black
good
brothers and sisters,
all good,
LGBTQ, all that. But what's interesting is when they detach themselves or unhinge from the Old Testament stories.
Yeah.
What I have found that's really interesting is it comes back to kind of bite them a little bit because it's very supersessionism. It's very anti-Semitic.
It is.
Because it's like, well, that's all ancient and old and wrong, and this is new, and so we'll leave that behind and we'll move forward. And you actually even have that. It's funny you even say that because it goes a step further. Lots of people are doing that even for the New Testament, the Bible as a whole. This is ancient literature, and it has nothing really to offer us right now.
Right. And if I believed what they believed about it, I would agree with them.
Whoa.
The last thing is that postmodernism, then it gets very frustrated and angry with traditional perspective. And that's why you will see not just that many postmodernists disagree with people who they call fundamentalists, but they have a real dislike of them. And they are very sometimes demeaning and attacking of those who are still in fundamentalism because they don't understand that is a perspective that is just where the page number, so to speak, that those people are on. And that's another defect of an unhealthy postmodernism. And
I want to come back to that because I think that's probably something most of our audience has struggled with or is currently struggling with.
Yeah.
So let's come back to that.
Okay.
People, Introduction to Integral Theology Part 2 was one question. We will make progress on the next episode. So anyways, Doug, thanks for being with us today. It was an honor to interview you yet again.
I'd love to come back.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.